The stars had been silent for centuries. Humanity looked up at the night sky with wonder and hope. They sent signals into the darkness. They built telescopes and listened for any sound from the void. They dreamed of meeting other beings who shared the universe with them. But when the answer finally came, it was not a greeting. It was fire. The Valkorian Empire had ruled 1,000 star systems for 10,000 years. They had conquered species beyond counting. They had burned worlds and enslaved billions. Their warships blocked out the light of suns. Their soldiers knew no fear and showed no mercy. When their scouts discovered Earth, they did not see a civilization. They saw only another world to consume. Admiral Vorath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion. It was a vessel so large that smaller ships could dock inside its hull. Around it floated 300 warships of the Imperial fleet. Each one carried enough firepower to turn a continent to glass. Vorath looked at the blue planet on his view screen. It was beautiful in a simple way. Blue oceans, green lands, white clouds. He felt nothing for it. His orders were clear. The High Emperor wanted this system. The native species would serve or die. There would be no diplomacy. There would be no warning. The Valkorian way was simple. Strike fast. Strike hard. Let the survivors worship you as gods. It had worked on 1,000 worlds. It would work here. The first wave of missiles launched at midnight Earth time. They fell on the great cities of the world. New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing, Moscow. The sky turned orange with fire. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled to dust in seconds. Millions died before they even knew what was happening. The attack came without warning. There was no declaration of war. There was no demand for surrender. There was only death falling from the sky. Admiral Vorath watched the destruction with cold satisfaction. His scanners showed the primitive aircraft of the humans rising to meet his ships. He almost laughed. Their flying machines were made of metal and burned simple fuels. His ships were wrapped in energy shields that could stop nuclear weapons. This would be quick. But something strange happened. The human aircraft did not flee. They did not beg for mercy. They flew directly at his warships, firing their primitive weapons. The bullets bounced off his shields like rain on stone. But still, they came. One by one, the pilots died. But more came behind them. They knew they could not win. They attacked anyway. On the ground, the surviving humans did not run to hide. They did not fall to their knees and pray for salvation. They grabbed weapons. They organized. In the burning ruins of their cities, they set up defensive positions. They pulled the wounded from the rubble. They shared water with strangers. They fought back with everything they had. Vorath, this was not normal. Every species his people had conquered had broken within hours of the first attack. The shock alone was usually enough to destroy their will to fight. But these humans were different. The more he killed, the angrier they seemed to get. He ordered his ground forces to deploy. 10,000 Valkorian warriors descended from the sky in their drop pods. They wore armor that could stop any human weapon. They carried plasma rifles that could vaporize steel. They had conquered 100 worlds. They expected no resistance. They were wrong. The humans met them in the streets of their broken cities. They fought with rifles and knives. They fought with rocks and bare hands. For every human that fell, 2 more appeared. Old men, young women, children old enough to hold a weapon. They fought without fear. They fought without hesitation. They fought like demons. Private Korath was a young Valkorian soldier. He had been taught that inferior species always broke. He had been told that conquest was easy. But as he walked through the burning streets of a human city, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear. A human male stood before him. The creature was wounded. Blood ran down his face. One of his arms hung limp at his side. He held a broken piece of metal in his remaining good hand. He should have been running. He should have been begging. Instead, he charged at Korath with a scream of pure rage. Korath killed him easily. His plasma rifle burned through the human in an instant. But as the creature fell, Korath saw others behind him. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They had seen their friend die. They knew they would die too. They came anyway. For the first time in his life, Korath ran. Admiral Vorath received the reports with growing concern. His forces were taking casualties. Not many, but more than expected. Much more. These humans refused to break. They refused to submit. Every street was a battle. Every building was a fortress. They rigged explosives and blew up their own homes to take Valkorian soldiers with them. He increased the bombardment. He burned entire regions to ash. Surely this would break them. Surely they would see that resistance was hopeless. Surely they would surrender to save what remained. They did not surrender. They got angrier. 1 week into the invasion, something unexpected happened. The humans launched their nuclear weapons. Not at the cities that still stood. Not in defense. They launched them at his fleet. Vorath laughed when he saw the missiles rising from the planet. His shields could stop such primitive weapons. They had done so many times before. He watched as the missiles approached his ships. He watched as his shields activated. The first wave of missiles were indeed nuclear. They exploded harmlessly against his shields. But behind them came something else. The humans had been busy during this week of horror. They had taken apart their nuclear power plants. They had modified their weapons. They had built something new. The second wave of missiles punched through shields that had stood for centuries. Vorath watched in disbelief as 3 of his warships exploded. Then 5 more. Then 10. The humans had figured out the frequency of his shields in 1 week, while being bombed into extinction. They had solved a problem that should have taken decades. For the first time in his long career, Admiral Vorath felt fear. On the ground, the tide was turning. The humans had captured Valkorian weapons. They had studied them. They had learned to use them. Plasma rifles that had been wielded against them were now wielded by them. Soldiers who had fought with sticks and stones now fought with alien technology. General Sarah Chun commanded what remained of the human resistance. She was exhausted. She had not slept in days. She had watched her family die in the first bombardment. She had every reason to give up. She refused. From a bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, she coordinated the global resistance. Every human with a working communication device received her orders. Every pocket of survivors knew they were not alone. The message was simple. Fight. Keep fighting. Never stop fighting. The Valkorian ground forces began to retreat. They had expected to conquer a planet in days. They had found themselves in a war they could not win. Every human they killed created 10 more enemies. Every city they destroyed made the survivors more determined. Admiral Vorath looked at his tactical display. He had lost 50 warships. 50. To a species that had never left their own planet. His ground forces were in full retreat. His soldiers, warriors who had conquered 100 worlds, were afraid to face humans in close combat. He considered his options. He could destroy the planet entirely. He had the firepower. One massive bombardment, and Earth would be nothing but a dead rock. But something stopped him. If he destroyed Earth, he would have to explain to the High Emperor how a primitive species had cost him 50 warships. He would have to admit that he had failed to conquer them. No, there was another option. He would leave. He would tell the Emperor that this planet was not worth the cost. He would recommend that the Valkorians avoid this system forever. As his fleet began to withdraw, Admiral Vorath took one last look at the blue planet. It was scarred now. Great black patches marked where cities had once stood. Smoke still rose from 100 fires. It looked wounded, dying, but it was not dead. And the creatures who lived there were something he had never encountered before. They were not the strongest species he had faced. They were not the most advanced. But they had something else. something that could not be measured or analyzed. They had refused to accept defeat. They had looked at certain death and chosen to fight anyway. Vorath gave the order to retreat. His fleet turned away from Earth and began the long journey back to Valkorian space. He already knew what his report would say. Do not return to this system. Do not engage this species. Let them have their small blue world. Because Admiral Vorath had learned something that day, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The humans were not a species to be conquered. They were a species to be feared. On Earth, General Chun watched the alien ships disappear into the stars. She stood in the ruins of what had once been a beautiful world. Billions were dead. Cities were gone. The damage would take generations to repair. But humanity had survived. They had faced an enemy they could not possibly defeat. They had fought anyway, and they had won. Chun knew this was not the end. The aliens would return. Others would come. The universe was vast and full of dangers. But she also knew that humanity would be ready. They would rebuild. They would grow stronger. They would reach for the stars themselves. And any species that attacked them would learn the same lesson the Valkorians had learned. Humanity did not surrender. Humanity did not break. Humanity fought until the last breath, the last bullet, the last drop of blood. The stars had been silent for centuries. Now they would hear the roar of a species that refused to die. The universe would learn to fear the small blue planet and the stubborn, raging, unbreakable creatures who called it home. They attacked without warning. The Imperial fleet attacked without mercy. But when the smoke cleared and the dead were counted, it was the attackers who fled. It was the defenders who remained. Humanity had entered the galactic stage, and nothing would ever be the same again.